I wanted to get your reaction to a conversation that we just had on the podcast yesterday, I believe. We had a gentleman on who was making a wide criticism of our academic epistemology, especially in terms of science, and that it was essentially set up at some point, I think around the 50s or sometime in the 20th century, that a good idea would be to let all of the nerds essentially uh, be the decision base for the government because they're all of these scientists were concerned with objective truth. They would make essentially great policy advisors and so forth. And in reality, it turned out that they were just human beings and they were easily captured by the same power influences as the politicians that they were hoping to, that everyone had hoped they would supplant essentially. And I'm curious what you think about the epistemology in the sciences, because on one hand, we would hope that we were coming to know more and more about the world in a very functional, practical way. But at the same time, there's a lot of stamp collecting and things that are funded because they're safe and practical. He brought up the case, particularly with the whole Wuhan Virology Institute, that was kind of a disaster where, people are trying to learn more about viruses, so they essentially start engineering really awful viruses, and then, you know, what becomes of that? Was that really a useful endeavor in the first place, or was it just a nightmare? And so, yeah, I'm curious if you think that academic science suffers from a failed epistemological methodology, or if you can imagine a better version of that, or if you think it's totally hunky dory.
Um, so with respect to the epistemological side of it, like, okay, um, what are the sort of appropriate scientific methods or something like that? Um, I I mean, I would just like I kind of don't really feel qualified to comment because I'm not a scientist, and I do feel like scientists seem to be able to kind of get along fine without the input of philosophers. So, you know,
I would
um,
say that they
but
can't. I think I
really,
Yeah, I don't think
genuinely.
so. I guess I should frame this a little bit better in that the thing that everybody calls the scientific method is in all reality much more an engineering method. It's a method of devising formula that are predictive that allow you to do something practical. And most of the funding that we would say is scientific funding is aimed towards some practical engineering output. Very little of it is science in the original sense of natural philosophy, like let's figure out how nature does its magic tricks. It's more aimed at harnessing those and parameterizing those phenomena. Even the thing that we call a theory in, say, physics, a theory in physics or in biochemistry is really an equation that describes how some system operates. It doesn't actually give us the component material actors and what's really happening. There's not necessarily a cause and effect picture there. There's really just a description that allows us to plug in different variables, change the shape of the wing so we can get better lift, get better efficiency, whatever it is, generate more conductive nanomaterials. They're always aimed at something. And so I think that the concern is that if science is left to the engineers, then you have only one knowledge base which is valued, and you don't have actual investigation into nature itself, which might not be valued.
I mean, I feel like you might not like my view on this because my general inclination is to favor a kind of instrumentalist account of um, scientific theories. So the sort of view I would have is that what science gives us are very useful tools, very useful instruments for predicting, systematizing, and controlling what we experience. Right. So it's like it's ultimately trying to give us descriptions that accommodate the observable phenomena. Like the theories and models, like they're instruments for predicting and controlling the observable phenomena. Um, that's the sort of view that I would favor. Now, the thing is, though, the caveat to this is that I don't think there's really any universal method that will promote that. So it may well be the case, and I think it actually often is the case, that one of the most efficient ways of coming up with theories and models that allow us to predict and control the observable phenomena, one of the most efficient ways of coming up with those things is by doing what we might traditionally think of as more sort of metaphysical investigation. So we're sort of interested in learning, like, what's going on behind the phenomena. What is the world really like? We want to get at the truth. We want to get at the facts. It turns out that if you have a bunch of people who devote themselves to that, they, as a very pleasant byproduct, they come up with these theories and models that are instrumentally successful. In the end, though, I mean, like, my view on this is, I don't think that science really gets at the truth. But that's not to say that there's anything, I mean, that's certainly, like, that's not to say anything negative about it, because nothing else, in my view, really gets at the truth either. So it's not as though science is in any way, like, I'm not denigrating it in saying that. But yeah.
Well, it's kind of crazy how you can develop functional models that will take you pretty far, but in order to punch through the next step, you do have to come to some actual scientific understanding. There's a lot of cases of this, but I mean, if you just think about, a caveman designing a bow and arrow, he didn't actually have to understand anything about air and molecules and laminar flow and all these things. He really just had to experiment with different designs and until he came up with a functional way of doing it. And a lot of fundamental science is done this way too, where you're also just trying different models on and tweaking them until you get something that approximates how some predictable behavior will unfold.
Archaeology too.
Yeah.
Just because, like, people find stuff because they accidentally stumble
they
on it in
stumble
the
on it.
fields.
Yeah.
Like, there's not that many places where people say, "Aha, we will go here and we will find it."
Like, and it just seems like it has a limitation to it if you get locked into that way of thinking. Anastasia came up with this really good example where we're just talking about the limitations of our mathematical conception of fundamental physics, where she was like, look, you could also imagine a parallel universe where people approached biology and genetics the same way, where instead of realizing that there was this actual material body called DNA that was responsible for inheritance, you could have just left it at math and come up with genetic fields to describe all of the behaviors in the nucleus. All of these hereditary actions were the results of hereditary fields. The fields interacted with a known set of equations. There was predictable outcomes, and you get pretty far. But you're never going to come up with something like CRISPR-Cas if you don't have an actual structural understanding of the genetic material itself. And so it seems like we run the risk of ending up at those brick walls in other disciplines, in particular fundamental physics. What were you going to say, Anastasia? Consciousness too.
I think that there's a piece of that I just realized while you were speaking, which is that we won't have CRISPR-Cas because we'll be so busy dealing with how to mathematically describe. Do you know what CRISPR-Cas is?
It's gene something to do with
Yeah. It's basically just like they found this bacterial immune system that they realized was used for changing out DNA base pairs, and then they found a way to be able to harness that inside of the body. And so you can take something that you found in nature, you can modify it, and now it can do in vivo genetic modifications for humans. But the reason that we wouldn't get to it in a mathematical genetic field universe is because we would be so busy trying to figure out the mathematics of how it worked that we would never get to the point of being able to say, hey, hold on a second, there's actually this thing that's a molecule that has a shape that we can modify, and because we've modified that shape, it behaves differently, and now it does this thing that we want, and we can cure cancer.
I do wonder, though, I mean, so we might not be able to get to something like CRISPR-Cas, but then maybe we would be able to get to other things that we are not so good at getting to. So that like in the mathematical field universe, would that necessarily be an impoverished science, or would it just be a kind of different science where we achieve different things? I mean, I don't know, but